My own son tried to sell my house from under me after tricking me into signing a legal document. He saw me as a frail old woman, a liability to be managed, not his mother. He took my car keys and installed security cameras, telling me it was for my own protection, but I knew he was building my prison. I had to sit there invisible in my own home while he and an appraiser discussed its sale as if I were already dead. He thought he had won, but he had no idea that I was about to give him a very public goodbye tour that would erase him from my life forever. It all started on a Sunday the way so many endings do. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the dining room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and making the silverware gleam. My son Kevin and his wife Valerie were over for dinner. From the outside, it was a perfect picture of family life in Westchester, the dutiful son visiting his widowed mother in the house he grew up in. I'd made a roast chicken, its skin perfectly crisp, the way Kevin had always loved. But something was off. The cheerfulness felt thin, stretched taut over a silence that had nothing to do with peace. Kevin couldn't seem to put his phone down. He'd lay it face down on the tablecloth, then a moment later, pick it up again, his thumb swiping anxiously. Valerie's smile was bright and brittle. It never quite reached her eyes. After dinner, as I was clearing the plates, the campaign began. It was subtle, a masterclass in planting seeds of doubt. Kevin started by mentioning how the front steps seemed a bit uneven, a real risk in the winter. Valerie chimed in about the garden, how it must be so much work for just one person. It was a beautiful performance of loving concern. They brought up the recent news stories about phone scams targeting seniors and how easy it would be for someone to take advantage of me. They suggested so gently that perhaps I should let them help manage my mail just to sort out the junk from the important things. They even offered to screen my calls to be a buffer between me and a world they had decided was too much for me to handle. I listened, a small, weary part of me just accepting that this is what happens. Your children stop seeing you and start seeing a collection of potential problems. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing a liability. A few days later, the second act of their play began. Kevin showed up alone, not with flowers or for a chat, but with a sleek leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He sat me down at the same dining room table, his expression one of solemn responsibility. He spread a fan of papers across the polished wood, explaining that these were just some routine financial documents. He used words like consolidate and efficiency, making it sound like he was doing me a grand favor, tidying up my life for my own good. Buried in the middle of the stack was a thicker document. He pushed it towards me, tapping a line with his pen. He said it was just a formality, a power of attorney in case of a medical emergency. He said it would allow him to make decisions if I couldn't, to ensure I was taken care of. He said it was what any loving son would do. And I, wanting to believe I had a loving son, picked up the pen. In that moment, the act of questioning him felt like a greater betrayal than the act of signing. So I signed my name on the line he'd indicated. I signed away my power because I still believed in my son. That evening, I was in my garden, my one true sanctuary. The scent of the climbing roses my late husband Charles had planted was heavy in the humid air. It was that peaceful, quiet time of day when the world seems to hold its breath. I heard Kevin's car pull into the driveway, the crunch of gravel a familiar sound. He must have forgotten something. I stayed where I was, hidden by the high hedges, content to just be. But then I heard his voice, a frantic, desperate whisper that sliced through the evening calm. He was on his phone, pacing back and forth. I couldn't hear all of it, but the fragments that drifted over the hedge were sharp enough to draw blood. I heard him say he needed to liquidate now. I heard him say the house was the only real asset. And then came the final chilling phrase that stopped my heart. I heard him say the deadline is the end of the month, or we lose everything. And in that quiet garden, surrounded by the life Charles and I had built, I finally understood. My home wasn't my home. My legacy wasn't my legacy. To my own son, it was just an asset. And the clock was ticking. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. The shock from Kevin's phone call in the driveway didn't fade into sadness or fear. Instead, it slowly cooled and hardened into something else, something solid and heavy in my chest, resolve. The woman who signed those papers was a trusting mother. The woman who stood among the roses listening to her own erasure was someone new. I spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet, meticulous observation, waiting for their next visit. When they arrived that Wednesday, all smiles and feigned concern, I was ready. I knew Kevin was the driving force, but Valerie was the weak link. Her desire to maintain the facade of a perfect life made her brittle. I waited until we were having tea in the sunroom. Kevin was on his phone again, of course, pacing by the windows. I turned to Valerie, my expression a perfect mask of gentle, elderly curiosity. I told her that after thinking about Kevin's smart financial advice, I was considering moving some of my own savings. I asked her about that new investment he'd mentioned, the one that was doing so well. I said I was thinking of putting a little something in it myself and wondered if she could tell me the name of the firm. The effect was instantaneous. Valerie's teacup rattled in its saucer. Her smile froze on her face, a brittle, painted thing. She started to stammer something about a very exclusive, a very technical opportunity. She couldn't form a coherent sentence. It was all the confirmation I needed, but the real show was about to begin. Kevin must have sensed the shift in the room. He swooped in, phone-pocketed, his voice booming with false confidence. He explained that it was a private equity fund already closed to new investors and far too high risk for my portfolio. He went on and on, burying me in jargon about venture capital and leveraged assets. His story was completely different from the incoherent fragments Valerie had offered. They weren't just liars. They were clumsy liars. Their guilt was a clumsy, panicked thing thrashing about in the open. That night, long after they had left, I went into my late husband's study. The old desktop computer sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. Kevin and Valerie saw it as a relic proof of my inability to keep up with the modern world. They had no idea I still used it, that it was my private window to the world they thought I'd left behind. I opened my email and wrote a message to Eleanor Vance, a dear friend from college, who had gone on to become one of the sharpest divorce and estate lawyers in the state before she retired. The message was short, just 2 lines. I wrote that it was time for that long overdue tea we always talked about. And then I added the words that would change everything. Something is wrong. Kevin must have felt the ground shift beneath his feet after my little question about his investments. He must have realized his amateur theatrics weren't as convincing as he thought. His panic manifested as an escalation. 2 days later, he came by with a grim look on his face and took my car keys. He told me the mechanic had called with terrible news, a serious and expensive engine problem, and that it was unsafe to drive. He said he'd handle it. The next day, a van from a home security company arrived. Kevin had ordered a new system for me, complete with cameras at every entrance. He told me it was for my protection to keep me safe. But as I watched the technician install a camera pointed directly at my front door, I knew it wasn't about keeping others out. It was about keeping me in. My beautiful gilded cage was now a prison, and I realized with a chilling certainty that my son wasn't just trying to steal my house. He was trying to steal my life. This was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. When you're a prisoner, the first thing you must do is convince your jailer that you love the cage. So I began my performance. I became the woman my son wanted me to be: frail, a little confused, and above all, grateful. When Kevin would visit, I'd thank him profusely for the security system, telling him how much safer I felt. I'd mention to Valerie how wonderful it was not to have to worry about driving anymore, what a relief it was to have them looking after everything. I learned to smile placidly when they spoke to me in that slow, loud voice people reserve for children and the very old. And it worked. I could see the tension leave their shoulders. Their visits became shorter, more perfunctory. Their panic had been a brief flare-up, and now they believed the fire was out. They believed they had won. Their misplaced confidence made them careless. One afternoon, Kevin was working on his laptop at my dining room table, a place he now treated like his own satellite office. I brought him a cup of tea, moving with the slow, shuffling steps I had adopted. As I set the cup down, I glanced at his screen. For a split second, I saw it. An email, stark and aggressive. There was a picture of Kevin and Valerie's own beautiful home attached, and a subject line in all caps, 14 days. The body of the email was short, but I saw the words, "We know where you live," before he impatiently clicked the window away. He didn't even notice I'd seen it. The full, crushing weight of his desperation was no longer a mystery. He wasn't just in debt. He was being threatened, and he was willing to sacrifice me to save himself. While my son saw a mother who spent her days napping and watching television, I was busy. Every afternoon during my rest, I would go into my husband Charles's old workshop in the basement, the one room without a camera. Behind a loose stone in the foundation wall, there was a small, hidden key. That key opened an old floor safe hidden beneath a rug in his closet. Charles was a man who believed in contingencies. Inside that safe was a life Kevin knew nothing about, a ledger for a separate bank account, with a balance that would have shocked him, and more importantly, the original unencumbered deed to our house. I took them, and from the same safe, I retrieved a small prepaid burner phone Charles had bought years ago for a trip abroad. That evening, in the quiet of the basement, I called Eleanor. I told her everything. A week later, Kevin made his final critical mistake. He had grown so comfortable in his role as my keeper that his arrogance was boundless. He brought a man to the house, a real estate appraiser, introducing him as someone who was just doing a valuation for new insurance purposes. They walked through my home, a home where every object holds a memory, and they talked about it as if I weren't even there. I sat in my armchair pretending to read and listen to them discuss my life's work in terms of square footage and market comps. I heard the appraiser tell Kevin the valuation was high, and that in this market, a property like this could have a signed offer within a week. I heard my own son agree, talking about me as the motivated seller who was ready to downsize. They saw a non-entity, a ghost already departed from her own life. And as I listened to them finalizing my erasure, I felt a fury so cold and so clear, I knew exactly what I had to do. He had just given me the weapon I needed for his public destruction. The appraiser's visit was the last piece I needed. Not for my plan, but for my soul. It burned away any last flicker of doubt, any lingering maternal instinct to show mercy. For the next 2 days, I continued my performance, shuffling through my home, a ghost in the making. Kevin and Valerie visited on Thursday, their confidence at an all-time high. They brought brochures for luxury retirement communities, spreading them on the coffee table, as if they were offering me a wonderful gift. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their thoughtful management of my life that they didn't even look up when the doorbell rang. Kevin answered it, his body language loose and proprietary, but his posture stiffened immediately. On the doorstep stood Eleanor Vance. She is my age, but where I had cultivated a soft exterior, Eleanor was all sharp angles, and sharper intelligence, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it contained articles of surrender. Kevin tried to block her entry, telling her his mother wasn't expecting visitors. Eleanor didn't even blink. She simply stated in a voice that brooked no argument that she had a scheduled appointment with her client, Agnes Holloway. She stepped past him without waiting for an invitation, her eyes meeting mine across the living room. The first crack in my son's empire had appeared. We all sat in the living room, the retirement brochures still scattered on the table between us. The air was thick with tension. Kevin and Valerie sat perched on the sofa, their smugness replaced by a wary confusion. I sat in my usual armchair, silent, watching. Eleanor opened her briefcase with a series of decisive clicks. She began calmly placing a single document on the table. It was an official, notarized revocation of the power of attorney. She explained that I had signed it 2 days ago and a copy was already on its way to my bank. Kevin's face went pale. He started to bluster to protest, but Eleanor cut him off. She then produced a copy of the original document he'd had me sign. With a pen, she circled a clause buried deep in the fine print, a clause that gave him the power not just to manage my affairs, but to liquidate assets. She laid out the clear, irrefutable evidence of his fraud. Confronted, cornered, and with nowhere left to hide, my son broke. It wasn't a crack. It was a complete shattering. He started sobbing, confessing everything in a torrent of pathetic, self-pitying words, the disastrous investment scam, the crippling debt, the threats he'd received. He admitted he was going to sell the house, my house, to save himself from ruin. The confession hit Valerie like a physical blow. Her entire identity, her whole world was built on the foundation of Kevin's success. As his confession tumbled out, I watched that foundation turn to dust. Her shock curdled into a venomous rage. She launched herself at him, not physically, but with words that were far more brutal. She screamed at him, calling him a failure, a liar, a fraud who had ruined her life and brought nothing but shame to their family. Their carefully constructed partnership dissolved into a storm of bitter, ugly accusations, right there in my living room. They had forgotten I was even there, consumed by the implosion of their shared deceit. I let them burn for a few moments, then I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through their screaming like a razor, silencing them instantly. I was no longer the frail, forgetful old woman. That person was gone forever. I looked directly at my son, then at his wife, and I took control. I told them this is what was going to happen. They would not sell my house. They would not be setting foot in it again after today. They would not be contacting me by phone or by any other means. Their access to my life in every conceivable way was terminated. And then I gave them their final instruction. I told them to come back here on Saturday at 10 in the morning sharp. As their terrified, confused eyes stared back at me, I delivered the final line. This, I told them, is what a goodbye tour looks like. They were left powerless, gaping at me, their faces a mask of pure terror at the public consequences I had just promised. The 2 days between Thursday's confrontation and Saturday morning were the quietest I'd ever experienced in my own home. It was the heavy, waiting silence of a theater before the curtain rises. I had Eleanor handle everything. The calls to the estate sale company, the invitations to friends and neighbors, the large banner that was delivered and stored discreetly in the garage. I spent the time walking through the rooms of my house, not saying goodbye to them, but reintroducing myself. By the time Saturday arrived, I was no longer the victim, the prisoner, or even the architect of a revenge. I was simply Agnes Holloway, mistress of her own home. At 10 o'clock sharp, his car pulled up. Kevin and Valerie got out, looking like ghosts. They were pale, sleep-deprived, their expensive clothes hanging on them like costumes they no longer had the energy to inhabit. They were clearly expecting a quiet, private execution in my living room. What they got was a public spectacle. The entire front lawn was filled with cars. Neighbors they'd known their whole lives were milling about, coffee cups in hand, browsing tables that were laden with the entire contents of my son's past. A huge banner hung from the garage, the words stark and brutal. The Holloway Living Estate Sale. Everything must go, and everything was there. His childhood desk covered in nicks and doodles. His collection of baseball trophies tarnished, but still gleaming. The ridiculously expensive Italian suits he'd stored in my attic, each with a price tag dangling from the sleeve. It was not just his property, it was his history, his very identity in this town being sold off piece by piece for pocket change. I stood on the front porch, Eleanor at my side. I was dressed in a bright, cheerful color, a stark contrast to their funereal attire. I waited until I saw the moment of full comprehension dawn on Kevin's face. He wasn't just losing an inheritance, he was being publicly dismantled. I tapped the microphone connected to a small speaker we'd set up. The small crowd quieted down. I looked out over the faces of my friends and neighbors, my gaze sweeping past my son as if he were a stranger. I told them that a home is a living thing, and sometimes, for it to stay healthy, you have to prune the dead branches. I announced that some things simply no longer had a place in this house. Then I held up a thick sheaf of papers. I told the crowd that this was my old will. This was the past. With a steady hand, I fed the entire document into the industrial-grade paper shredder set up on a small table beside me. The machine whirred to life, its grinding sound the only noise in the stunned silence. The true punishment wasn't anything I did. It was the collective gaze of the community. I saw the appraiser Kevin had hired standing near the driveway, his mouth hanging open in disbelief, before he shook his head and walked away. I saw neighbors' people who had watched Kevin grow up staring at him with a devastating mixture of pity and contempt. He was a pillar of the community who had just been exposed as a man who would defraud his own mother. The whispers, the averted eyes, the sudden cold distance that was his judgment. In a town like ours, where reputation is everything, he had just suffered a mortal wound. He shrank under the weight of it, becoming smaller and more insignificant with every passing second. While the shredded remains of the past settled in the bin, Eleanor placed a new document on the table before me. With the entire neighborhood as my witness, I took a pen and signed my new will. Eleanor, in her capacity as a notary, affixed her seal with a decisive thud. I then took the microphone one last time. I announced that the bulk of my estate would be split into two parts. First, a significant donation to the local women's shelter in honor of women who find the strength to start over. And second, the remainder would be placed in an ironclad educational trust for my granddaughter to be managed by Eleanor, ensuring her future would never be squandered. To my son, Kevin, I said nothing. I didn't look at him. I didn't acknowledge his presence. In the final accounting of my life, he was not a beneficiary. He was not a villain. He was nothing. He had not just been disinherited, he had been erased. After the last car pulled away from the estate sale and the professional cleaners had packed up the tables, a profound quiet settled over my house. It wasn't an empty silence, but a peaceful one, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. I didn't have to see my son again to know the consequences of that day. In a town like ours, news travels faster than a winter wind. Eleanor kept me updated, of course, but mostly I heard it in snippets from friends at the grocery store, in the concerned tones of my neighbors over the phone. The story of the living estate sale became a local legend overnight. The fallout for Kevin was immediate and catastrophic. I heard their membership at the country club was under review, which was the polite way of saying it was revoked. Friends they'd had for decades suddenly stopped returning their calls. They were social pariahs, a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties. Within 2 weeks, a for sale sign went up on their own manicured lawn. The creditors he had tried so desperately to hide from were no longer patient. The life he had committed such a monstrous betrayal to protect was gone anyway. The final pillar of his life crumbled about a month later. Valerie, whose entire existence was predicated on the image of success, could not withstand the public shame. The foundation of their marriage, I realized, wasn't love. It was status. And with that gone, there was nothing left. Eleanor informed me quite professionally that divorce papers had been filed. Kevin was left utterly alone in a house he was about to lose, a man who had gambled his family, his reputation, and his mother's love on a desperate bet, and lost everything. He had tried to erase me, and in the end had only succeeded in erasing himself. I felt a pang of something, but it wasn't sadness. It was the faint phantom ache of a wound that had finally truly healed. While his world was shrinking to the size of his own failure, mine was blossoming. The proceeds from the sale, the money from his trophies and expensive suits I used to hire the best landscape architect in the county. My garden, my sanctuary, was completely reimagined and reborn, filled with vibrant new life. With the money from Charles's secret account, I modernized the kitchen and put in a walk-in shower, making the house truly mine for the years to come. I started hosting a weekly bridge game, and on a warm evening in late summer, I threw a garden party for all the friends and neighbors who had stood by me. The house was filled with warmth and genuine laughter, the ghosts of the past finally banished by the light. I was no longer a ghost in my own home. I was its undisputed, joyful queen. My life was not about him anymore. It was about me. Weeks later, I was sitting on my front porch swing, pushing my granddaughter gently as we watched the fireflies begin to dot the twilight air. Down the street, a stark white sign with the word "sold" in bold red letters was planted on the lawn of what was once Kevin's house. My granddaughter, with the simple wisdom of a child, looked up at me. She asked if I was sad. I stopped the swing and looked out at the home I had fought for, at the garden that was thriving, at the quiet peace of an evening that belonged completely to me. I thought of the cage I had been put in and the fear I had felt. And then I thought of the quiet strength I had found within myself. I smiled a real, genuine smile that came from the deepest part of my soul. I told her, "No, my dear, I wasn't sad at all. I was free." In the end, it was a simple, brutal lesson in value versus worth. The son, blinded by the monetary value of a house, forgot the immeasurable worth of the woman who made it a home. He saw his mother as a final asset to be liquidated, a last resort, to solve the problems his own pride had created. In his desperate attempt to erase her from the deed, he only succeeded in erasing himself from her life, her legacy, and his own history. He learned too late that when you treat a person like an object, you forfeit everything that is priceless.